Hi everyone, thanks for coming today evening. Uh, Harsh Mander believes the COVID pandemic has been followed by a pandemic of amnesia. He says he writes because we must not forget. He writes to rage. He writes because he wants us to grieve. He writes because he thinks the humanitarian crisis was not created by the virus. Harsh, tell us a bit about why we must remember.
Um, yeah, thank you all of you for being here, and thank you for these two wonderful people who will be speaking about the book. Why did I write the book? I wrote the book because it is probably the greatest single humanitarian crisis that our country has seen since partition. And the tumult, the suffering was so intense. Anything between 500,000 and 5 million lives were lost. And a great part of that loss of life was entirely preventable. I was amazed at how quickly we seem to have forgotten. This should have been central to public debates, to the elections that followed, but nobody's talking about it. And I see it as a kind of imposed amnesia. And I wrote the book. My editor, and very dear friend Ravi Singh, told me, "Don't worry, not too many people may read the book today, but 30 years later, this is the book that they'll go back to understand what happened." So for next generations, no, I really want us, all of us, to remember. And I say we must remember for 3 or 4 reasons. I start off, in fact, we must remember to grieve. And every single life lost, if we do not even give that life the dignity of grief, then, what are we saying about that life? That every life is grievable is where I start my book. Every life lost is grievable. So we must give ourselves time to grieve. My own father died in the middle of the COVID, and we had to sort of struggle to put his ashes in a locker, actually. And it took almost 2 years before we could get everybody together, people to love and who loved him, to remember him. So to grieve was where I wanted to start. The second is to rage. We must rage because it was spectacular how our governments failed us. And I would underline, and I hope in the conversation, we also failed each other. India's corporate and middle classes failed the working poor profoundly. And we must remember that to rage. I also say I want to remember also so that I can hope, because of the stories of kindness that I saw on the ground over and over again through all of this. And what would our grief and our rage and our hope build into is really what we must do to not let this ever happen again. And WHO recently said the next pandemic, there's no question that it's, if it will come. The only question is when it will come. So when we are struck by another humanitarian crisis, if we don't remember, if we don't grieve and rage and hope, what are we going to ask our people to go through the same suffering and the same tumult all over again? So what do we need to do to ensure that next time our governments and you and I handle this greatest humanitarian crisis in some ways of a century? How can we handle it better?
Arvind, what do you say about the power of remembering?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And firstly, thanks for inviting me to be on the same panel with both Priya and Harsh. And Harsh, as I think we all see him in many ways as really the conscience keeper of our people and of our country, really. And in many ways, he invokes the best that is in all of us. And each time you see him, it's an example. And you say that, can I be a better human being? That's the question he brings to mind. So I think in many ways, you think of Harsh, you think of Gandhi, you think of Ambedkar, you think of a range of figures who are so important, especially in today's day and time. And on the particular question of remembering, the entire book actually, I mean, I'm sure that as when we go out, all of you will pick up a copy of the book. It's really an extended meditation on maybe what the way Milan Kundera put it, the struggle of man against power is a struggle of memory against forgetting. And I was just sharing with Harsh that, all his work is really, right from the Gujarat 2002 onwards, is really a part of that persistence of memory. Saying, we will remember what happened. And Harsh has indicated again the question of why he chooses to remember. And equally importantly, what he chooses to remember. The why he chooses to remember is part of the question that, of course, when you talk about the struggle of man against power being the struggle of memory against forgetting, remembering is integral to our very humanity. And I think what Harsh is invoking in us is saying, can we remember so we be more human by the fact of remembering? And that comes through the range of stories in the book, And I think if we talk about the range of stories in the book, we'll take a long, long time. But I'll just mention, I think the two stories which he begins with, which are actually absolutely lovely. And then you say, there are people like this in this country, and we see only what we see on the media, which is such a tragedy, right? The book is actually, he begins with a tribute to Dr. Pradeep Bijalwan, right? Who Harsh describes as a very close friend. And it's a very beautiful and moving story, which I didn't know about Dr. Pradeep Bijalwan till I read this book. So I was like, wow, this is so amazing that, to hear the story. And why did I not know about this was the question in my mind, And Dr. Pradeep Bijalwan is a practitioner, again, of a concept which I didn't really know, or what Harsh describes as street medicine, right? Street medicine, is that what you call it? Street medicine, that's the concept, right? And the idea being that there are people who believe that it might not be easy for the homeless to go to a hospital because of various reasons. Because of the question that you go to a hospital, you're excluded immediately. Hospitals may not welcome you, etc. Right? So the concept of street medicine is when you go to the street and you work with patients on the street, provide them the help that they need, and persuade them, if required, to go to the hospital. And this really remarkable person who Harsh describes in great detail, Mr. Dr. Pradeep Bijalwan, died during the second wave because of a lack of oxygen. And that links up, of course, to the question which we'll go to, which Priya has already told us we will go to, which is the entire question of public reason, right? And failure of public policy. As much as it's grounded in act of remembering, it's also an invocation of a future which could be very different from the future we had if the government had made very, very different choices. The other story which he does briefly mention, which again struck me, which is very, very beautiful, is a story of these two young men called Amrit and Sayub. Amrit is a young Dalit man, and Sayub is a Muslim man, and both are from working in Surat. And during the lockdown is imposed, again, the story comes through so powerfully, right? I mean, lockdown is imposed, some people can retreat within the walls of the home. But if you don't have enough money and you don't have enough food grains, what do? That was the situation which these two young men found themselves in. They somehow get the money to get onto a tempo, and as they're traveling, Amrit starts falling a little ill, and a little bit of fever, etc. And everybody in the tempo is scared, saying we are escaping COVID, and these two guys have spread COVID. This guy has spread COVID to all of us. They say you get off the bus. So Sayub also gets off, and the image which Harsh describes, which is there on, if you look at it, it's there online as well, is of Sayub cradling Amrit in his lap as Amrit is dying, right? And there's a very beautiful piece written on this by Bashrat Peer. And The description of this is a Taj Mahal to friendship, right? And so again, these are beautiful, moving stories which are there, which actually invoke a common humanity. And I think that's the greatness of this book, where it takes you back again and again and saying, going through the bleakest situation, and tells you there's still people who do things different. And of course, the greatest story of all is the story of Harsh, who again invokes this larger question of public consciousness, as far as all of us are concerned. Yeah.
But despite all the humanity and you evoke and invoke in the midst of all this suffering, one of the main points you make is that this suffering was not caused by the coronavirus. In its response to the pandemic, you say the Indian government aligned itself entirely with the India of privilege. The state forgot about the majority who would have no way to earn money if they stayed at home. Laborers, daily wage workers, mechanics, self-employed rag pickers, street vendors, those with disabilities, older people who had no one to support them at home. And I found something that you quoted from Kritika Srinivasan, also very powerful, Harsh, where she says, at a time when money and privilege lost their protective bubble, and at a time when we became aware that our health is tied to the health of others, we wanted the state to take strong measures to protect us from the other Indias. So essentially, we were terrified in a time when all the multiple Indias were clashing briefly and visible to us.
The inequality that, India's middle class, I belong to the Indian middle class. I've grown and lived my life here. I find us among the most uncaring people in the world. And that is something that revealed itself very dramatically during this time of crisis. First, our government. I mean, when the Prime Minister made that announcement, I was watching, he's saying, stay and work from home. Okay. Has he forgotten that 9 out of 10 workers in this country are informal workers? If they don't work tomorrow, they won't have food tomorrow. I mean, he hasn't thought about them. Then he says, keep social distance. 6 out of 10 Indians live in one room or less. How can they keep any kind of social distance? You live in a slum shanty, 100 people, 150 people share a common toilet. Has he forgotten about them? Wash your hands regularly. I mean, people don't have running water. It was apparent to me at that moment. I mean, I knew it, but it was a moment where our government is not for the poor at all. It didn't care what happened to them. Then the middle class is called out to celebrate on their balconies. You have to have a house with a balcony first, What about those who did not have? And inevitably, and I work with homeless people, so it was even more. And so I resolved at that moment, I'm not going to obey any lockdown. I'll be on the streets from tomorrow. And a group of us started, and then it grew and grew into a very large enterprise to try to fill in the gaps of what the state did not do. And the whole, the whole list is, I do talk about the failures of the state, and in the many, many ways that this could have been avoided. To begin with, just the lockdown. There are many countries in the world which did not go in for a lockdown. South Korea is a very good example, for instance, where all they did was test. Everywhere you went, the metro station, bus station, you'd keep getting tested. Moment you were tested, they would have small, clusters of protection, etc. India has, it's the largest lockdown ever in human history. What we did. China, at its peak, locked down 5% of its population. We locked down 100% in 3.5 hours' notice, and we had no relief package. So some of us went to the Supreme Court, and then with Prabhat Patnaik and Joyati, I wrote a series of op-eds saying, if people in the formal workforce are getting their salaries, the least we can do is to ensure that people in the informal workforce get the equivalent of statutory minimum wages. And they were sort of accomplished economists. They calculated it would have cost 3% of GDP alone if we had done this, if we had cared. And if that 3% of GDP had been spent, actually the migrants wouldn't have had to leave. You know, there wouldn't have been all of those people on the streets. And the breakdown of our economy would not have happened because people would have had small amounts of money in their hands. And I've always believed that compassionate public policy is also always, sensible public policy as well. We didn't do it. We went to the courts. They still didn't do it. Then when the migrants started walking, so many middle-class people said, like, where did all these people come from? I mean, where? Yeah, 30 million people walked. Please remember, it was the largest distress movement human history has ever seen, of people walking hundreds of kilometers, and we briefly saw who they were. Who are these people? I mean, you think of any average day in your life, who delivers milk at your home, who delivers the newspapers, who comes in and cleans the floors, who looks after your children, who cooks your food, who drives you to work. It's all of the people around us, and we didn't care about what was going to happen to them. And we could have shared, at least the people in our immediate circle, we could have all reached out. When we started distributing food, we used to get these extraordinary phone calls from people saying, my domestic help is somewhere, please give her food. Like, why can't you give her food? Many things happened during that period which reflected one central truth, and that's a truth that I want you to confront with. We live in a country where some lives are precious and need to be protected. And a huge number of lives are entirely dispensable. They don't matter. They don't matter to our government. They don't matter to people of privilege.
Harsh, I'll ask Arvind, what do you think is the role of courts in a situation like this?
Yeah, no, I think the answer is, Harsh actually elaborates upon that in the book. And the failure of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Bobde was palpable, where the response, in response to a question of what about the migrants, when the Solicitor General comes in with a statement that there are no migrants, the court takes the Solicitor General at his word. So there's
also that no one is hungry.
Yeah. I just want to get a little bit back to Harsh's point on the lockdown. If I can just read a small part from the book. And again, it's a question of today, shining a light back and saying, was the decision of the stringent lockdown justified? That's the part where, for example, we've spoken about Harsh and his public conscience and the question of passion and empathy, but also a strong rooting in reason and public reason. And he asked this question, the very important question, as should the decision of the lockdown have actually been made? What policy grounds is it justified on? The question he asks is the policy of the conclusion he comes to, rather, the policy of a stringent lockdown was dangerously wrong in principle itself. The lockdown was disastrous public health, disastrous economics, disastrous sociology, and unconscionable public ethics. Unforgivable for a country with enormous, historically embedded economic and social inequalities. So a large part of the book actually elaborates each of these points in great detail. So you actually get a very good insight into what was wrong with this decision. Harsh mentioned China, but the other country he references, which I think is worth reading out too, is, one way of thinking of public policy is, okay, fine, India made this choice. What are the other choices other countries made? Even China, as Harsh indicates, even with its harsh lockdown, initially was 5% of 1.4 billion people. The other country he picks up on is actually, he says maybe people won't like it, but it has to be said, which is what did Pakistan do? What did the playboy of Pakistan, Mr. Imran Khan, decide to do compared to the more humble Prime Minister who we have? The Playboy of Pakistan observed that in Pakistan, 25% of the people are below the poverty line. They can't afford even 2 square meals a day. If working class Pakistanis are locked up for 2 weeks, how will they feed their families? So it's really, I mean, look at that and say, wow, where did this decision actually come from? How did it come to a decision such as this? In Harsh's response, I think, the way he puts it, the catastrophe we find ourselves in is the direct outcome of leadership of hubris and narcissism with enormous pathological absence of compassion. I think each of these are actually very powerful points and worth looking into in greater detail. I'll just make 2 points actually. When the question of hubris comes in, I think what you have a distinction which actually this political scientist Juan Linz makes between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And one dimension of the current government is an authoritarianism, which means it's sultanist, unlimited public discretion. You can't question the leader because the leader will decide. And I have a sneaking sense, the hubris point is this. You have the chance to tell the world, I put 1.3 billion people under lockdown. Who else in the world has done that? It's only me. That's the hubris point, which comes through, I think, very, very powerfully in terms of why that happened. The second part of it, which I think is also very, very important, is the pathological absence of compassion. Again, we see that today. That is the reality we see. A leadership with a pathological absence of compassion. And again, I was going back to this and saying, where did the previous reference to this come? And if you go back to to a piece written by Ashish Nandi called Obituary of a Culture, post-2002, he makes this particular point. I'm just going to read out a part of it, where he says that the current Prime Minister would be what you describe as an authoritarian personality, with certain, what he calls, a mix of puritanical rigidity, narrowing emotional life, massive use of the ego defense of projection, denial, and fear of his own passions, combined with fantasies of violence. Leave the rest of it. I don't know how to understand that. I'm not a psychoanalyst. But the one part of it which made a lot of sense to me is the narrowing emotional life. And I thought about that again and again. In fact, the book made me think of it even more strongly. Because what you have in the book is a widening of emotional life, saying that, the other person matters, or constantly the invocation of the other person matters. And we take it at the level of leadership. The leader you think of, again, I mean, with a great deal of, a sense of a lack, is actually Mahatma Gandhi. And go back to Nokali, right? And the entire question that, when somebody in your country is suffering, your role is to console that person. Your role is to be with that person. And here you have a narrowing emotional life, where you find a complete inability. I think there's a certain inability to emote and to empathize and to care as far as people are concerned. So I think Harsh has got something very important over here. And the question is, what do we do with this kind of an understanding of what you'd call a pathological and obsessive personality trait, which tells you then, we go back to the understanding that, who should the next Prime Minister be? I think we should take this particular dimension into question when we think of who the next Prime Minister should be.
Before you continue, I just wanted to take it away completely from the pandemic. Recently, we all read about this railway police constable who walked through a train and without anyone stopping him, he picked out 3 people of Muslim visibility and shot them to death. The next morning, actually, a young Muslim colleague of mine, she walked into my room and sat down and started sobbing. And she said, I have not been able to sleep since I read that. That man could have been my father. That man could have been my brother. That man could actually have been me. I was traveling on a train just yesterday. And when she was speaking, I realized that probably at least in 1 million Muslim homes across the country, that same conversation would be transpiring. And what do you need from a leader? You want a leader who reaches out to you. And I wrote a piece, actually, saying the speech that the Prime Minister did not make. And I make that speech. I say that, I feel great anguish that it has happened. And then I feel even more anguish because it was done in my name. He mentioned my name when he did the killing. And I want to assure you, people of every religion, that you are equal citizens in this country, that I care about your pain. And, even Trump after George Floyd's killing, made actually a very passionate speech about how horrible it was and how painful it was. Macron, when the recent, he made a speech about how it was completely unacceptable. We see a silence. We cannot have, we can't live. I mean, why are we choosing to live in a climate which is so bereft of public compassion?
But Harsh, it's also the citizenry. If you see how the way we reacted to the murder of Junaid on a train 5 or 6 years ago, and how we've reacted to this latest incident.
There's no outrage. I mean, at least in these other two countries, people came onto the streets after this happened. It was a very similar incident. A uniformed policeman kills people because of their identity. And we've just absorbed it and lived it on. And in 1 million homes, people are weeping and saying, it could have been me.
To go back to the migrant journeys, Harsh, they did shake India, however, briefly. And you put it beautifully in your book. You say, the resolve taken by millions separately, and yet in a strange unison of purpose, was to journey home whatever it took. And one laborer you quote in your book says, I will do anything if the government tells me they can take me home to my mother. Can you talk about this?
When people came onto the streets in their millions, one question was, where did they come from? Who are they? Where are all these people from? But the other question was that, I said, could any of us ask, suppose you were in a place far away from your home, suddenly you had no money to pay your rent, to buy your food, to have medicines. You had no kind of access to healthcare. Where would you want to be? You'd want to be at home. Even if I have to die, let me die among people who love me. Was it so, so difficult to imagine that when you're doing this to people where, as I said, the large mass of our working people are migrants from villages, why did we not anticipate that this is what they will do? And if you didn't want to do them, as I said, just give them equivalent of minimum wages right through the period of the lockdown. They wouldn't have needed to do this. So, yeah.
And they suffered so much that many of them said that they would not come back. Like one man you quote, a 22-year-old man, says, I will not make my children go through such suffering again. We will manage with whatever we get.
And yet, the greatest tragedy, and I followed many of these people, is that they did come back. They did come back because once you went to the village, the reality that there was just no future, no employment, you had to keep your children alive, so you came back. A friend who's a labor economist said something very profound to me, it was Ravi Srivastav. He said, many things broke at that moment when the migrants began to march. But the thing that broke most was trust. And he said that people know that they're being exploited. They know that they're getting a very bad deal. But they had a belief that when a real catastrophe hits us, the government and our employer will protect us. And what was demonstrated at that point is your government and your employer doesn't care a hoot about what happens to you. And then you come back. So our workers who have come back without even the comfort of this trust. That has broken down, but you still come back because you have no other options.
You were saying something?
Just maybe to just elaborate on a couple of the points which Harsh has already made. The question of the migrant labor is an issue we all saw, and many of us were involved in what happened at that moment in time. And I think the question of memory again is, what is it that you want to remember from that particular period in time? One, of course, is the fact that, as Harsh mentions, 200 people died on the road due to exhaustion, hunger, heat stroke, accidents, all of which are completely avoidable and preventable. The other point which Harsh mentions, of course, is the fact that 30 million people migrated during the lockdown. Again, this is not required for people to walk during that entire period. The question of mass hunger, which he raises again, I mean, again, that tells you about the, getting back to the point of the lack of compassion. How do you impose a lockdown when you don't provide for the most basic right of people, which is the right to food? And the contrast again, in terms of, we saw in terms of other leaders, where they'd make the point that we have your back, the constant reassurances, we have your back. So that dimension was completely absent. Maybe the other point to make is also the point which you make, actually, I'm just adding to it, which is the idea that the question of the lockdown also had implications in terms of social and economic policy. And Harsh makes the point quite strongly that the lockdown functioned in two ways. It's a kind of a shock to the system. And there's an entire analysis by Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine, where a shock is used to push to get through a range of laws which make the situation worse as far as the most marginalized are concerned. And there again, Harsh gives the examples of a range of labor laws, right from Uttar Pradesh to Karnataka to Goa, all, to Gujarat, all of which are changed, where you have the hours of work is increased up to 12 hours, labor laws are exempted completely in certain states, etc. Right? So you're entrenching in place a greater level of inequality than in the past, using the lockdown as a way of getting forward changes which might have otherwise found quite difficult to put forward. And I think I'll just put one last line with which he kind of concludes. He concludes on the lockdown. It's spectacularly alarmist and resulted in a sledgehammer strategy to protect only the privileged and bring immense suffering upon the poor. Harsh has elaborated the passion and the emotion underlying it, but there's a larger argument as well as to what happened during the lockdown.
Yeah, and just one, just an illustration. Suppose we had to go in for a lockdown. The day the lockdown was announced, there were just 500 cases detected in the country. If we were convinced that we had to have a lockdown, if we had given 1 week for people to go where they had to go, and I took out this figure, every day our trains carry 23 million people. 30 million people had to reach home. Suppose we had just said 1 week, trains will run free, go where you can. And, and there were just 500 cases, people would not have carried the virus, people would have reached home, the discomfort. It's this imagination. And one last thing that I want to add. Gandhiji keeps coming back to my mind in these times that we're living in. One of the things that he said was that in times of confusion, I'll give you a talisman. And think of that talisman. His talisman was, think of the weakest, most vulnerable person that you know. And think what you're setting out to do, what will be the impact on her life. He said his life, he should have said her life. And it's so powerful an idea. Suppose the people who sat down to plan the lockdown actually then imagined a blind widow living in a faraway village, for instance, or people like that. And then what is this lockdown going to do to her? And he said, and then once you use this talisman, all your doubts will fade away. Which of us are even looking at that talisman?
Months after urban India was blown away by the dramatic images of migrants going home, India's laboring poor disappeared from our TV screens and even from the inside pages of newspapers. You say, Harsh, as a nation, we have perfected the art of looking away. And in fact, that is the title of one of your previous books also. How do you keep looking in a nation of people that looks away, that is known for looking away?
Let me quote something that actually Prophet Muhammad is supposed to have said. It's something, it's a profound thought. What is your duty when you encounter great suffering and injustice? And he said, at the very least, respond from your heart. Means at least feel badly about it. Then he said, some among us who are stronger, better, would respond from their tongue. that you'll speak out against it. And a few of us will respond with our hands, we'll act against it. My problem with my country and my sisters and brothers in the middle class is not that there are not enough people speaking out or acting. It's that we don't care. We're not responding from the heart. If enough of us responded from the heart, even if we didn't speak out and act, we'd be a very different country. My biggest problem with the Indian middle class, with my own people in a sense, is that I don't know where we've lost our capacity to care. Our extraordinary capacity to look at suffering and turn our faces away. And just think about it, and I'll give you just one example, because again, working with homeless people. I am quite sure that the first time a child going on a car, in our car, and sees a child her age out there in the cold, in the pouring rain, in the winter, in the hot summer sun, feels distress. What do we teach that child? We teach that child not to feel that distress and to look away. And perhaps it has a lot to do with our history of caste. It has to do a lot also with the neoliberal idea that greed is good. Neoliberalism was an economic package, but I think much more than that, it was a moral. It was a moral set of principles that greed is good. Think only about yourself. You don't owe anything to anybody else. And I think we've absorbed that in a foundation of centuries of caste, which is again that the accident of your birth legitimately determines everything else, what you can aspire to, whether you live at all, and what kind. We're comfortable with inequality culturally and emotionally. And if there's one change, in fact, when I speak to young people and they say, give us one piece of advice that you would say. And I say in 2 words, I say, be kind. If enough of us are kind, we'll reason what is wrong. We'll stand up and fight against injustice. We've stopped responding from our heart. And that's really my distress. Much of my writing is an effort to actually, and I tell stories largely to, empathy is only later an act of feeling. It's first an act of imagination. At least begin to think, what would life have been to you if suddenly, I'm just saying, if suddenly if we in the middle class were told, no salary from tomorrow. Just that. We're locking down the country with just no salary tomorrow. Your health insurance isn't going to work. You'll have no access to health care. You have no salary. We'll still be living much better off than most other people. But what would we have done? We'd have screamed our heads off. Why could we not think that that's happening to the next person just right there? And when the people came out and started banging the thalis, I just said, what has happened to us?
Harsh, one of your chapters highlights what was the most terrifying part of the pandemic for me. And this went beyond lack of compassion. It was like something very menacing. And your chapter is called, Did the Coronavirus Turn Muslim? And I will just quote what you wrote. You said that we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is caused by a highly contagious and potentially deadly mutating virus. But for this to mutate in India within a few days of a national lockdown into a conspiracy by Muslims to infect and kill non-Muslims is a stunning accomplishment of right-wing communication and mobilization with few parallels anywhere in the modern world. I honestly think we were the only country in the world to use this terrible moment in history to spread hate faster and more efficiently. And I wonder if that was the time when this whole idea of the economic boycott of Muslims that we see spread across our country today, whether that was like when it started.
It certainly, I couldn't believe. I mean, I know how the right wing propagates, an alternative, vision of the world and its analysis of what's going on. But still, an entire country is locked down. We're faced with a virus that has brought the whole world on its knees. And people are in hunger, all sorts of, it's a calamitous situation. And it took less than a week for, our TV channels, our social media, and, and the way the idea spread that somehow this is a conspiracy that India's Muslims have waged against the rest of our people. What an absurd idea. But the fact that it was really believed in so many parts of the country, it just knocked me down. I mean, this idea that actually they are now deliberately putting their spit on vegetables, which they will then sell us, and then so that we get the virus. I have a lot of my colleagues, we started, it started off with just a human response that some of us went on the streets, some of my colleagues came, friends, and we had the Karwane Mohabbat is really a collective which came up in different parts of the country, in which Priya is also part, where people came together to respond to the violence and hate violence. When this happened, spontaneously that entire collective came together. Because people started, somebody called us, and somebody else called us, and then somebody called us from somewhere else, and then somebody called from Jharkhand that, can you get a message to someone in Jharkhand from Bombay to something. And so we developed a whole kind of spontaneous, a spontaneous kind of collective. But why I'm saying this is that a lot of them are Muslim. And so many of them told us that people, when they went with food to somebody who was hungry and they revealed their identity, people would turn them away and say, "This, you are the cause of this." I heard hundreds of stories. So this business of understanding who we are, not only were we indifferent to the suffering of the poor, we also allowed, the idea that one little gathering, which was with permission in one building in the national capital, is actually the source of COVID all over the country. And the next year you had the Kumbh Mela, with everybody knowing with their eyes wide open in the middle, and that, nobody talks about that.
And then courts had to spend months undoing all the arrests and all these Tablighi Jamaat arrests.
We had people from around the world spending months and months in jail, being charged with spreading COVID. They'd come here with permission. I mean, it's a religious group. I mean, you can disagree. I disagree with what the vision of the Tablighi Jamaat is, but that's irrelevant. They believe in returning to the fundamentals of what they understand in Islam. They gathered together. They gathered with permission. And you suddenly have blamed them. There's a particular story, and I thought I'd tell it. It's again a reflection of, it symbolized to me what Indian middle class is. In a place in Defense Colony in Delhi, it's a sort of very upmarket place. Family had a tragedy, the father, the grandfather, the grandmother, everybody was badly sick with COVID. They were struggling. This was right in the beginning. And I think the grandfather died. In the middle of all of this, someone in the family decided to file a complaint. And what complaint did they file? They said their security guard, who is Muslim, actually secretly went to the Tablighi Jamaat, and he must have brought the virus. The police quickly registers a complaint against him. The poor guy runs away. The police quickly finds him, arrests him, and then they test him. And he turns out to be negative. Nobody apologizes to him. Then the story emerges that actually their grandson was studying abroad and he had just returned. And he probably is the one who had brought in the virus. these people had no business calling in the working class person. So it was far from him endangering them. They were endangering that working class man. And apart from doing all of this, I mean, this is what we are. And that story of that family didn't end because 2 weeks later, they can't manage without domestic help. So they got this Jharkhand young woman to work. And they tested her, they sent her for testing for COVID. And the third day the report came, it was 10 o'clock at night. And it turned out that she was positive. And they turned her out onto the streets. She's 18 years old. It's city and curfew. And she started wailing loudly, and they wouldn't allow her in, and nobody took care of her. And then some neighbors came out and finally were able to help her. You know, it's a story that symbolizes to me, what we are capable of. And this thing of the Muslim one also came into the middle of all of this. The poor guy happened to be Muslim, and he kept saying, I didn't go to the Tablighi Jamaat gathering. And he wasn't positive. And as I said, nobody apologized to him.
And also, Arvind, that was the time when we started arresting activists who had been active in the anti-CAA movement. And in addition to spreading organized Islamophobia, we used the pandemic to curb dissent. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think again, Harsh refers to this in the book. And it ties in again to the larger idea of the shock doctrine. The country is under shock, everybody is under shock. And by shock, it's a very important point. What you mean is that our ability to communicate with each other has kind of been shut down. We don't have this ways of building a public resistance anymore in the way we knew in the past. So in that moment when people are isolated, people are alone, you're going after the most vulnerable, even among the activist community. If you look at Father Stan, arrested 80 plus, arrested during the pandemic. Gautam Navlak, another 60 plus, arrested during the pandemic. So there's a way in which the pandemic was used to take forward the agenda of the powers that be, of the government in power. To get back to one point which Harsh made, which I wanted to actually pick up a little bit on, is the notion of looking away. I think that's again very central to Harsh's work, where he's always I wouldn't say encouraging, but rather telling us, no, don't look away. Look, don't look away. That's the point he's always making. And he made a passing allusion, which is there actually in the book, which is, does that question of looking away come from the deeply ingrained notions of caste which we have in this country? And interestingly, I mean, when you made that point, I went back to if you look at the Baba Sahib Ambedkar's works, he has one particular piece where it looks at the conditions precedent for the successful working of a constitution. One might be the opposition party, second is constitutional minority, third is something he referred to as public conscience. So what he means by public conscience, I'll just read it out to you. Public conscience means a conscience which becomes agitated at every wrong, no matter who's the sufferer, and means that everybody, whether he suffers that particular wrong or not, is prepared to join him in order to get him relieved. So there's a way in which, again, the important point, I mean, Harsh, I'm taking your point of coming from the passion and the emotion. There's a larger point you're making. If you're talking about a democracy, you better not have people who look away, because the essence of a democracy is the question of a public conscience, that you must care what the other person is suffering. So I think, again, though you're putting it in personal terms, what you do is something we all should do, and that's your invocation to all of us. Something that's the only way you'll be a successful democracy, if we learn the art of not looking away. And that ties into I think one last point I'll make. The other principle, which I think Harsh is the most strong advocate we know of, in the Constitution, in the preamble, we have liberty, equality, and fraternity. And liberty and equality, well theorized, fraternity is not talked about much. And again, the point, you go back to the Constituent Assembly debates, it's Ambedkar who's responsible for fraternity entering the Indian Constitution. And the point he makes again and again is liberty and equality without fraternity is no deeper than a coat of paint. You can see the connection between fraternity and public conscience and a successful working of a successful democracy.
Just to deviate from the book, Harsh, the idea of bhaichara and all that is very prevalent in Nu. I remember when we went on a trip a few years ago, and you've just come back from there again. Has anything changed? What has changed?
In fact, in the India Forum, my story about what's happened in New Hazima, I wrote it. It was it's a long story, and I won't carry it very long. But the Mewatis are actually, the Meo people are actually an extraordinary people, because there's a huge convergence of Hindu and Muslim traditions that they have lived with. Yet in 1947, there was a huge slaughter, and it was Gandhiji who went on December 19th, just a month and a half before he was assassinated, and he told the Meo people who were leaving for Pakistan that, no, this is your country, stay on. And they celebrated with song and their folk songs, everything, remembering Gandhi Baba coming and saying, this is your country. And look at where they've reached. Pehlu Khan's lynching was bad enough because it was by a sort of a faceless mob that gathered with sticks and stones and beat him to death. Yet he and his family were charged with wrongdoing. Nobody has been punished. And then a series of lynchings happened. But today we've evolved into a very different phase, where actually what is happening is they're organized gangs now. It's the Bajrang Dal, Gaurakshak groups, which are formally recognized by the government. They work closely with the police. And on Facebook Live, they'll go and shoot at people, they beat up people, and it's all on Facebook Live. And what do you think the people there are going to feel? I mean, they've reached a stage, 3 people were recently lynched. The main accused has done this all on Facebook Live. Nobody has touched him. They're refusing to arrest him. Then he puts out a taunting message. The police says they can't find him. He puts out a taunting message. I'm here, I'm coming. Or aap apne Jija's brother-in-law, it's a sexualized thing. Your brother-in-law is coming, and so on. And a point is reached when the young people just can't take it any longer, and there's violence and much else. What I describe there is actually, what have we reduced our people to? And I'd had a series of discussions with them in recent months saying, because I was beginning to hear this business about, now there's no recourse except violence. And I was telling them, I won't give you an ethical discussion, I'll spare you that. I won't give you a political discussion on non-violence. Just practically you'll do 5 violence and they'll do 100, and you'll be finished. And that's precisely what happened. The government came out, for about 5 days they've destroyed, almost they razed the whole place to the ground, and so on. And when I met last the Mewati guy, and I finished my article with it, he said, what have I learned? I've learned now when the Bajrang Dal guy comes to me and beats me up twice, I will fold my hands and say, please, please beat me 4 more times. Is this, and that is the net outcome, because the rest of us don't care. No borders Gurgaon. No was identified by Niti Aayog as the most backward district in the country. And it's got 80% Muslim population. And then you have Gurgaon. And the first time I'm hearing some voices of protest in Gurgaon because of the boycott, where will our domestic helpers come from? Fraternity, my very dear friend Arvind I try to, what does fraternity actually mean? The Hindi word is bandhuta, which is a lovely word, which actually, कि हम एक दूसरे से बंधे हुए हैं. We're bound to each other. So for me, fraternity means that if there are chains on your feet, I feel my freedom has been stolen from me. If Pehlu Khan is, lashed on his back, my back feels the pain. If a Dalit girl has been gang raped, it's like my daughter has been gang raped. That is fraternity. And if there is fraternity, we won't allow, half of India's Fortune 500 companies in India are all headquartered in Gurgaon. What kind of modernity is this? I don't understand.
Harsh, let's take a break and talk about those individual gestures of empathy that you did encounter during the pandemic.
Yeah, if you recall, I said in the beginning, I write so that we can grieve and rage. And we've done a lot of that, but also because we can hope. From the first day, it was, not just I who decided to be on the streets. There were many others. And it was so wonderful to watch. Really, firstly, my own colleagues, I couldn't tell anybody to come out. But one by one, people started coming out. They said we can't go back to our families, so we had organized for them to live in the office. I asked one young person, why are you doing this? And he said, my fear of COVID is huge, but much greater than my fear is their hunger. And so I have to be on the streets. I saw so many people coming out when the people were marching. I saw people coming in cars, emptying out food, giving it to people, water packets, quietly going away, coming back again. Those are the things. The second, even more frightening, the second wave. There were amazing stories. I mean, we heard about the Gurdwara starting the idea of an oxygen langar, which was just an extraordinary idea in the middle of all of that. People were doing cremation. I mean, people weren't there to even, bury or cremate their bodies. I have a story here where a photographer says that he was taking pictures and there was a crematorium, and this man comes to him and says, please take a picture of the smoke up there. And he says, why? And he said, that's my mother. I was not allowed to, to see her before she was cremated. That's my only memory of her. In these times, there were people who said, we will cremate, we will bury, regardless of faith. There were people, I'm reading about this young boy, I think Badoria was his name or something. His father died because of lack of oxygen. From the next morning, he sat down, he created a sort of online help kind of thing, trying to help people. And I think a few hundred people he saved. He was weeping through the time that he was trying to help people. So I believe that we're not lost as a people because these examples are also there. Our capacities for goodness still endure, and it is these that we need to nurture and strengthen. Howard Zinn is a historian, and there's something quite lovely that he said, which I've now put on my email signature. He said, human history is not just the history of cruelty and oppression. It is also the history of kindness and courage. And it is important that we recognize the latter, because what we emphasize in this complex history of ours is what will define what we become. So yes, there are stories of kindness, extraordinary in these times. And and let us remember them, let us celebrate them, and let us sort of say, this is who we are. Not that defense colony house.
And even those of us who didn't actively spread hate, or our memories of the pandemic are very different from most of our fellow citizens' memories. I will read out something that you say about people like us. We felt safe inside our homes, often deprived of household help. We were inconvenienced, but mostly adjusted willingly for our own safety. We also adjusted to working from home, secure that our salaries and savings and health insurance would see us through. We celebrated the cleaner air and the bird song that we enjoyed because of the lockdown. We grappled with boredom and occasional depression, but it was a time also to rebuild our bonds with families. Through all of this, we were conspicuously indifferent to the reality outside the thresholds of our safe houses. where the lockdown had fallen like a meteor on the lives of millions of working poor. I'll ask you all for last comments and then we'll open it up for.
Yeah, maybe last comments. I mean, I was thinking again if why you should buy this book or why you should read this book. It embodies to me three particular virtues, if you think of it, right? One is the entire question of, there's a strong substratum of feeling and emotion and passion which you've got in this course of this conversation. The values both of, what Harsh describes as rage, in Harsh's own understanding of what rage is. What Harsh describes as compassion, which you've got a good sense of what compassion is. And the third, of course, is the question of grief and how important all of these are I think, in the broader sense of us being fully human. That's one dimension of it. But the other dimension of it, which is, I think, equally strong, is the entire question of casting a very strong light on the entire question of public policy and the idea of public reason. Where was public reason in this entire process? And was public reason actually there? And what could the alternatives have been? And he spent some amount of time looking at that. And I think that, again, is part of the invocation to the future, when we need to look closely and say that, what were the possible alternatives? Should we not be asking this question? Was a lockdown the right decision at all? Why isn't the media or whichever forum reporting that particular, discussing that particular dimension? And the third dimension to me, why the book is very, very important, is it's also a form of what you'd call fearless speech. In the sense that I think the point which Priya wanted to ask Harsh, but Harsh actually said no. We don't want to talk about this, but I said we have to talk about this, is a part of the book is something which I think is very, very moving, where Harsh, at the height of the lockdown, he just described how he's working at the ground level with communities in terms of distributing food, etc. And he knows at some point in time the virus will get to him. The question then is, the virus does get to you, what do you then do? And Harsh took a decision at the time. He checked himself into a public hospital. And again, look at the reasoning under that. He says the reasoning under that is a sense of rage that, that all the public officials, when something like this happens, they go to the best private facility. And what does that mean? Does it mean that our government facilities are not good enough? Does it mean that look away? Does it mean that people don't matter? So he says, I will check myself in a public hospital. And he does that, and he describes that in some detail as to the entire consequences of that entire admitting into the hospital. He admits himself to the hospital. He suffers what he thinks may have been a fall in the hospital, and finally gets out because of the intervention of his wife. And luckily he gets out because there's damage to the brain. And luckily they're able the doctors are able to look into the damage to the brain and take corrective action. But again, that to me is somebody who puts their life on the line. Literally, right? It's not somebody who's just speaking from out there, but somebody who puts his life on the line, saying that, I'm going to be here regardless of what it means as far as my life is concerned. And that links up, I think, to the last part. I think I'll end by quoting what he says finally. He says, at the time I write this, I realize that my body is still ravaged. I'm still to regain the fitness I've taken for granted all my adult life. Through all of this, I also battled, and I'm still battling, wild charges against me by the government, including those of insurrection, hate-mongering, and high financial crime. But I remain determined to speak out against the savaging of the Constitution and of our freedoms, justice, and fraternity. My body will take time to be restored, I realize that, but my voice, my spirit, my solidarity, and my love, for whatever these are worth, will not be vanquished by the virus or even by an uncaring, malign state. So he really ends with this. And so I think the last part of it actually is the reasoning and the passion and the emotion coming together in the form of fearless speech. And again, there's a very beautiful book by Foucault where he talks about the idea of fearless speech as speech when you put your life on the line. And very few people embody that kind of speech, and Harsh really embodies that. And it's a really privilege to be on this conversation with him. So thank you, Harsh, really, for this.
Thank you, Harsh.
I also wanted to say that I couldn't have chosen two finer people who read my book and took it to heart and mind and presented much of what I tried to say much better than I could have. So I'm grateful for that. I think that there's one thing that we still needed to talk about is what would we do the next time? And I think that's a terribly important question. Especially when I read, in fact, just a couple of days ago when the WHO said, yes, it's coming. We don't know when, but we will see this again. What are we going to do the next time? And I think that I just wanted to talk about, we don't seem to be learning any lessons at all because of this background of some lives being important, some lives being completely dispensable, and our capacity to look away as a people. The first is, of course, the public health system. And one fact, 8 out of 10 doctors in this country, and this is after a large part of the doctors have already left for North America and Europe and so on. Of those who are left behind, 8 out of 10 work for private sector hospitals. We are one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world. Can we at least confront that? Can we at least at last now say we have to have a public health system which is not built on super tertiaries like All India institutes, but on a strong primary healthcare system? Let's learn at least that first lesson. And the second biggest lesson to me is labor rights. We cannot have a situation where, we didn't even have, I'll just give you a small anecdote. When we, Prabhat Patnaik and Joyati and I were discussing, and we were saying that, okay, suppose the government accepted our demand that minimum wages should be paid, at least because of Narega, we do have a listing of workers, we have their bank accounts. It could have been done expeditiously. In cities, we don't have a listing at all. We won't know who the workers are. The government is so indifferent to them that there isn't even a listing of them. And really, I was asking Prabhat, how would we make this work? And he said, actually, I can't think of any other way except like in an election, every adult comes, you give them their money, put a mark, and say, okay, next month you'll come. And we were reduced to that. And we're not talking about how can we allow our working poor to be so utterly unprotected that we don't even have a listing of them, let alone anything else. So labor rights would be the second. And there were many other things, but I'll just talk about something that I'd read about the 1896, I think, the Bombay plague, which took a lot of lives. And during that time, a colonial administrator showed the compassion and the public reasoning that you talk about. He said, there are actually something we can do to ensure that this never happens again. And all we have to do is to ensure that every resident of the city has two things that will come completely free. One of them is clean air, and the other is clean water. 1896. And look at what we've done to our cities, and look at the informal settlements. So my plea to every one of us is that at least let us start thinking, that let us build a country where at least this kind of suffering is not imposed on large masses of our working poor. Let's address, as I said, public health, labor rights, and social housing. Let's just start with these. So let's really Noam Chomsky actually somewhere talks about social protection. He defines social protection as the idea that we should take care of each other. It's one of my favorite lines. Some of the most profound philosophical ideas are actually the simplest. Can we build a society, a country, an economy where we must take care of each other?
Thank you so much, Harsh. I'll open it up to questions now.
Harsh, this is a question that you can answer based on your former life as a bureaucrat. Early on, you talked about how instead of having a lockdown with 3.5 hours notice, if it had been a week or so, that almost everyone could have been moved back to wherever they wanted to go to. Similarly, about the statutory minimum wage, if it had been paid, that it would only have cost 3% of our GDP. I'm a little perplexed as to why the bureaucrats in the PMO didn't give at least the first part of the advice to the high and mighty. I refuse to believe that he took this decision all on his own after only 500 people had been infected. At the same time, when you wrote your exam, the Mahatma Gandhi was an essential part of the general knowledge paper, that even if a lot of people just memorize what they think might appear in the exam, something will probably sink into their minds. It's been eliminated now. And if we were to only add, in addition to Gandhi, Ambedkar and, let's say, Tagore, I'm sure that something will stick in the minds of these people. If you'd like to comment on that, on both those points.
I was part of the IS, and I loved the years that I spent there. You were very close to people most in need, and you had the authority and the resources to actually make a difference for justice. And that is why what I observe around me causes me so much more distress than it would to an ordinary citizen who's not been part of the civil service, who don't realize how much power you have. There is nothing that could have stopped people from civil servants across the country from organizing, even if the center did not give them resources, organizing a great deal that could have prevented this suffering. I think we're passing through a time when I see every institution, every democratic institution, the media, the judiciary, even civil society, in academia, in significant levels of breaking down in terms of their democratic responsibilities. But with much grief, I would say that if one institution has totally collapsed, I think it is the permanent bureaucracy. And please remember that Sardar Patel had talked about them as the steel frame of this country. So his imagination was that, as we go, caste and communalism and perhaps classism and many other things, gender violence, all of this will happen. But these will be the people who will stand upright like a steel frame, holding the Constitution in their hands and their hearts. And they've not done that. They've abandoned it completely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, who advised all of this and who kept advising them? And if you didn't have the ideas, we came out with the ideas very quickly. But the fact that they did not, we had a highly privatized healthcare system. What could we do at that time? We had to create more beds. We had to respond. You had to nationalize the public health system, say that for the period of the pandemic, every hospital, every doctor, every nurse is a public servant. And we will then organize. I mean, these are not, and countries like Spain did do that. These are not they're not rocket science kind of ideas. You have Gandhiji's talisman in your hand, and and the Constitution in the other, and these are reasonably simple ideas. The fact that we didn't come up with them and that the civil servants did not protest and did not do their own initiatives, except with some very rare examples, is a profound reflection on how far we've lost our way.
Next question.
Thank you so much for the insights that you've shared and for the time. Very touching book. Many themes in that, what you spoke today, I want to connect to a point which bothers me, and in the context of the inequality that you see where we are not concerned about each other. Themes like universal basic income as a concept, if it was there. I see new AI that the way it is coming in, and I'm a student in that space. And again, I see that same behavior, of the society where the rich will become richer, the poor will become irrelevant, and we are not discussing the irrelevance that we are creating. So, is AI the new pandemic, and any thoughts?
No, it's a great question, and I think it's pointing to something that I worry a lot about. The new economic model is just not creating jobs, and that's if I have to identify the hate that is sweeping the politics of hate that is sweeping the world could not be simply a matter of chance and coincidence. I mean, it is that young people actually today, by and large, don't have a future they can look forward to. And either they address what is wrong or they are encouraged to look for scapegoats. I saw a World Development Report just before the pandemic, which was the first which actually acknowledged. And what was their solution was something that you spoke about a moment earlier. Was that it doesn't matter, we won't be able to create jobs for everyone, we'll just give everybody a basic income. Now, to me, it's like a dystopic idea. We don't work simply so that we get an income. You work because you want to be, that's the way that you give back to society, you engage, you have relationships, you contribute something of value. Is our vision for our future that a few people will work, make huge profits, and the rest of us will get a small paycheck in our homes, and we'll have nothing to contribute to the world? It's really dystopic, and I think we need to. Today, I'm continuously going back to Gandhiji, but there's something that he said was that it's a crime. I mean, it was an extreme position, but he said it's a crime to use a machine until if there's a single person who's unemployed. And he said that's why he felt that full employment should be your first aspiration. And then you start mechanizing in ways that doesn't. Now, it's to many people it would sound like a strange kind of idea, but as we progressing in the world, you're beginning to recognize that let's first think about an economic model which allows people to have decent work, dignified, decent work that gives them fulfillment, and not permit technological changes that will. I don't know what the future will look like if most of our young people formally are told no future for you, and one little paycheck every month.
So the popular perception is that India has managed COVID very well, in fact, better than any other country. All the COVID mismanagement doesn't seem to have affected electoral outcomes also. So how do you explain this?
I keep asking myself that. A catastrophe. I mean, people saw bodies floating in the rivers. People saw, public parks with burning pyres. I mean, the title of the book that I wrote is "Burning Pyres, Mass Graves, and a State That Failed Its People." It's there for all of us to see. What's happened to us is a much bigger question. Part of it is this politics of hate that has surrounded us. Time magazine actually did a cover story, a very detailed. They followed one migrant worker during that long march, and all the distress that he went through. In the end, they ask him, this time reporter asks him, and who will you vote for next time? And he says, of course, Modi ji. So, then that reporter happened to have interviewed me, and he ends with, actually, he asked me, how do you explain this? And I said, I'm not sure I understand, except that there is a particular drug that is so lethal, which is being injected into the veins of our society every day, and that drug is hate. And intoxicated with this drug, everything is acceptable to me. Hunger is acceptable to me. Joblessness is acceptable to me. The complete mismanagement of the pandemic, 30 million people walking in the hot sun and dying. People choking outside hospitals. I mean, all of this happened before us. How can anyone claim that it was, and of course the publicity that government spends, I describe also how the vaccination failure is again, it's spectacular. We were the world's biggest producer of vaccines. In fact, we should have also helped not just all our people, but people in the global south. And for that, you had to have compulsory licensing. You should have allowed everybody to. And why did you choose 2 private companies? Nobody is ever able to. Not the public sector also. Why did you choose any small number? Why didn't you ensure that everybody could produce vaccines? We could have produced it well in time. And millions of lives could have been saved. And we don't have an outrage of that. I mean, I can't explain why we are not questioning our government for all that is happening around us. And the only partial understanding is this politics of hate, which seems to have enveloped us in this high of hate, where nothing else seems to matter. Therefore, also these conversations are really important.
Hi. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Arvind. About the grief and the rage, well, I think some of us do feel it very much, but the hope that the next time it happens, we will be better prepared. Well, one of the suggestions that I have, which could be very naive, and that is whether any other health care system could work other than the allopathic medicines that we were all given when we had the virus. Because when the vaccine came in and was given at great cost, boosters, it used the same homeopathic principle of injecting a little bit of the virus into our bodies so that our bodies got antibodies. We prepared it within ourselves. Well, there's something like that could be thought of, could be analyzed, could be researched, could be made available, because these remedies could very well be 100th or 1,000th the cost of more expensive allopathic remedies. That's a question that I have. I don't know whether I'm being very stupid, but it's just something I was thinking of. The other is that the distrust that Harsh has talked of, the mistrust, it has been with us for so long. I mean, people with disabilities, think of Mr. Jaipal Reddy, who used to be called a langda. Think of the vocabulary we use. Why is it that an act of kindness is so rare that it takes a headline in the newspaper? Does it have to be like that? Can't we all be kind all the time? I'm visually impaired. There are people who brush past me because it takes me time to come down steps. There are also people who advise me, who help me. But those who brush past me are many, many more, especially among the young, than the person who's kind and suggest something that I can do. I mean, just think of the way we use each other with disrespect, with cruelty, even unconscious cruelty. We don't even realize it. We are snobs, even within ourselves, within the same community, within the same colony, within the same families. Why have we become like this? Why? Where is karunyam? Where is daya? Where is just plain respect for each other? It's gone.
So, ma'am, on your first point, I believe that in a time like this, we should rely on science and evidence in a big way, and it should be publicly debated. And by all means, if alternative health systems have stuff to offer, it should be publicly debated, scientifically examined. But what happened during this period was also that, I talk also about how science was given a complete, was set aside, scientific committees, their suggestions, everything was set aside. I am not qualified to say whether homeopathy has an answer or not, but certainly it's a question that needs to be scientifically considered as part of. But the latter question that you raised actually brings me back, especially when you talked about young people being more uncaring. I don't, I sort of fiercely come in defense of young people, because I think it is the way that we are raising our young people, and that is a problem. It is our older generation, people like me who either have no hair or white hair, who actually are responsible for, if we see failures in young people's response, it is, I think, the examples that we ourselves set. And going back to a completely different example, among many things that were happening to Muslims, during the Ramzan period, people gather for prayers, and it was the month in which the Quran is supposed to have been revealed. And we found in high-rise after high-rise in the NCR, groups of 50, 30, 40 men would gather and scream and shout and not let them pray. Now, what troubled me was not those 40, 50 men. What troubled me is that there are 3,000 other apartments in each of these high-rise locations where nobody came. So if you're not going to go there as an elder and demonstrate compassion and solidarity, how can you expect that our children will learn? I was raised, fortunately, after the first decade of freedom, in a time that was far more idealistic. I mean, I recall, for instance, that your mother would say, "Don't waste food. There are hungry children outside." You were always reminded that you have a responsibility to people outside. That ostentation is not acceptable. That wearing a jacket with a little bit of a patch was actually much more stylish than wearing some shiny branded coat and so on. There was a way of life that we were raised in, which we are not raising our children in.
Hi, I've been an admirer of your work. I read your paper in, it was called Barricading Justice. I think you wrote it in 2015. So it had a big impact on me. Your words had a big impact on me. So I've followed your work kind of since then. And one of the questions that I had is, like, while I was reading about whatever was happening in India during the first lockdown, the second wave of COVID and everything, my mind kept going back to the paper that you wrote about the under trials who already don't have a lot of resources and rights and everything. So I haven't read your book, but is that kind of mentioned, or is there any talk about it, or how the entire pandemic, especially the second wave, how that affected all those people who were stuck inside these prisons with no chance of bail, no chance of hearing or anything.
I do, there's the last part of the book where I say, how would I have handled? Because I have no business to be critical if I don't tell you in detail what could have been done. And one of the things, of course, was to empty out our prisons. I mean, we have people with petty crimes and so on, and political prisoners. All of them should have been emptied out. I mean, that was elementary as one of the things that we should have done. We instead filled our prisons with more people. Yeah.
Good evening. My question to both of you, that what message was conveyed to the underprivileged classes, such as migrant labor and unorganized sector workers? And second question. Sorry?
One question, pick whichever you want.
Just one question about
No,
that.
Harsh will answer one, so.
Okay, so this one, what message was conveyed to the underprivileged sector and unorganized sectors, laborers,
Message conveyed by who?
by the government in terms of public policy?
Yeah, I think since you asked both of us, I'll prefer Arvind answers it. No, I think the message that came through over and over again from the first announcement is that for millions of people, working poor, their lives don't matter. It came through over and over and over again. And other things also, if the state does something for you, it's an act of benevolence. Vaccines have always been free. They're free all around the world. We've had polio vaccines. We've had all kinds of vaccines. You mucked up and perhaps some million lives were lost. And then when finally we started our vaccines, there was a 2-week interregnum, and suddenly we woke up one day, every public building, school was, thank you, Modi ji, for giving us vaccines. And I think the amount of money we spent on, so the other is that, we live as, we're not citizens any longer, as political science Neera Chandok recently said very strongly. She said we become subjects rather than citizens. And subjects wait, and jab daya aati hai, to vaccine aapko mila, to that is, I traveled abroad at that time, and the vaccine certificate used to have Mr. Modi's picture, and people would look at it and say, no, that doesn't look like you. I'd say, no, it's not meant to look like me, it's my Prime Minister. And they'd laugh. No country in the world was doing this, yeah. So I think these two things, that their lives don't matter, and if we do anything for you, we're doing you a great favor.
Do we have time for one last question?
Can I be permitted one small question, actually? First of all, thank you very much for writing the book and for the three of you to have come to help us think about it. I'll go and buy a copy. Of course, I came in at the last moment. Just to ask, you have talked about you mentioned toward the start of this discussion the issues regarding the legal framework and the legal fraternity. We've talked about, we know that there was some data of 380 doctors having died. We don't have any idea really how the legal, actually I don't, how the legal fraternity behaved, and how, is it possible for you to tell us a little bit, very quickly, but how the law and the management of the law in India happened during the COVID period?
I don't know if Arvind wants to respond to that as well, but largely we used the PIL route. In fact, Prashant Bhushan was our lawyer. We made very passionate arguments, and they were straightforward arguments. Yeah, just give people, survival wages, give them food through this period, etc. The fact that it was not accepted, and I'll say this, I keep getting charged from time to time with contempt of court, but let me invite it once again. There's something that the Chief Justice actually said, which was the government reported that we are now giving food. So we were saying wages and food. The government said everybody is getting food, which was a complete untruth. Our learned judges who were listening to the case said, oh, if they're getting food, why should they be getting money? And I really wanted to get up and say, Mr. Justice, I undertake to send you really good food packed every morning, evening, and night. You should not get your salary. You know, this idea that poor people are human beings just like us. They have all the set of needs. They're not people surviving on some free food. So but on the other hand, yes, when we were looking for money to send migrants home, we sent about 70 buses. Actually, my daughter's a lawyer, so she got a lot of lawyers to contribute. So, so that is also true. Let Arvind just.
I'll just add one very quick line in terms of the response of the Karnataka High Court under Chief Justice Oak was really exemplary in many ways. As much as the Supreme Court failed, I think the various high courts around the country really rallied around, did a very, very important job. And I think the role which the Chief Justice played again is saying that we can't intervene in policy. Policy is something the government sets, but we can ensure that your policy fulfills the mandate of the fundamental rights or does not violate the mandate of the fundamental rights. So in a sense, even the fact that we had migrant trains in Karnataka, it owed to the petition in the court and the court's particular orders and the dialogic process where the court pushed the government to really concede on the entire question of running trains for laborers. And similarly, the range of directions, right, on food security, Anganwadis, prisoners, which the animals who were in pet shops, etc., and pet dogs on the street, which the High Court passed. So actually, the High Court played a very, very important role in ensuring that your policy does not violate fundamental rights. And again, I think if there's a model, that is the model. You're not the bench was very clear. We're not intervening in the policy, but we're ensuring that the policy conforms to the constitutional mandate. And maybe one other line I'll just quickly add is we have an organization called the All India Lawyers Association for Justice, and they did a lot of work on the entire question on the point you raised in terms of what is the impact on lawyers in particular. If the lawyers who passed away, lawyers who are in difficult times, they wrote letters to the Bar Council to take the matter up and to try and deliver some form of redressal as far as lawyers in difficulty were concerned.
I think we're done, Harsh. Okay, thank you so much for coming, everybody. Don't forget to buy the book on your way out.
Yeah, and thank you all of you. Thanks to, it was a great conversation. I think far better than the book, but still buy the book. I'll leave you with a final thought, actually, just what governments could do. I was very concerned about what was happening to homeless people in particular. So I asked my friends in London, and they told me every single homeless person is in a hotel from 7-star downwards. I said, what happened? They said that the government, and that was the right-wing government of Boris Johnson, the government was paying the price of every homeless person was living in a hotel through the lockdown. The hotel industry ran, people had jobs, and every homeless person was looked after. These are not ideas that are so hard to find if we have the places in the heart for them, and if we recognize the equal worth of every human being.